Laureata.
I knew Roger Goldsworthy a little. I wish I had known him more. I had enormous regard for him, and I'm fortunate to have had some insight through some of his children, who I have the honour of calling my friends. Roger Goldsworthy's career prior to politics was fairly distinguished as well. My mother-in-law was one of his students at Gillies Plains High School and had him for physics. She showed me a photo of her class recently, and I reflected on, I think it was the member for Hyson who reflected on the hair, or was it the leader? The leader had the story about the hair, and I tell you what, those photographs of that rich, curly hair were memorable. She remembers him fondly. He was a teacher, he was a father, he was a servant of the community, he was a friend to many. He was also a constituent of mine for several years, and I first met him at Balmoral in Dernancourt for that period of time when that was in my seat. I subsequently also had the privilege of serving the community in Paracombe that he and his family added so much to, that the member for Schubert now serves. The Goldsworthy name is indelible with those parts. But I remember when I visited Roger and Lynn at Balmoral, being struck with the grace and the dignity with which he comported himself. A substantial figure of South Australian history, and I was somebody who'd been an MP for about 4 or 5 years at the time, didn't know much at all, certainly by comparison, but he had time, he had advice, and he had interest. At the funeral service, the family offered substantial reflections, and they were incredibly good to hear. Richard Yields talked about the same topics that the Premier, the Leader of the Opposition, the Minister and others have, the most substantial Minister for mining in South Australia's history, and the impact of the work that he did against the tide and against common opinion at the time, which now has such a substantial impact on the way in which we are all able to live our lives and the prosperity in which we find ourselves. They were important reflections. But I was struck by the reflections of David Cox, who's with us today as well, who, despite having been a political opponent during the 1980s as an advisor in that field, despite having served the Labor Party in the federal parliament, became in later life an extraordinarily good friend of Roger Goldsworthy's through the Friday lunchtime group at the Naval and Military Club. And I loved hearing about the ways in which Roger and David and their colleagues would solve the problems of the world right up until very recent times. To the age of 95, so interested in our state, our future, our community, and with a perspective he was willing to share. I am incredibly interested and think it's worth mentioning his legacy as Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, a role he took on in the 1970s at a time when the Liberal Party needed to be brought together. In becoming the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, he served our party, through our party, our state, with dignity, respect and a sense of servant leadership. The Minister for Mining talked about the way in which he pursued the Olympic Dam proposal against the tide, against potentially political interests. And I think it was that suppression of self, the suppression of one's own political interests, that also was the hallmark of his term for 15 years as Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. He put the party's interests and the leader of the time's interests ahead of his own, and by doing so he served the state. And that is a role model, I think, that all deputy leaders worth their merit should aspire to. Having done the role for about 2 years and 9 months and having aspired to do so in the tradition of Roger Goldsworthy, who did it for 5 times longer, I particularly again reflect Lynn. Thank you for what you and Roger served the state in that way. I've got to say, it can be a tough job, and he did it with grace, with dignity, and with other people's interests at heart always. He was very proud of his children. I know the pride he had for Mark, who we all know reasonably well, and I know how proud he was that Carolyn was awarded the OAM earlier this year. I know how interested he was and how proud he was of his children's service. So to Carolyn, Mark, Reese, of course Lynn, to grandchildren Caitlin, Fraser, Zoe, Harry and Tom, and to Zara, much to be proud of, and Roger Goldsworthy will not be forgotten for as long as this Parliament stands.
Could members please rise so that the motion can be carried in the customary manner? The House is suspended until the ringing of the bells.